Helen Joyce, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
So, Helen, you're one of the big voices in the debate about trans issues around the world, and particularly in the United Kingdom. The UK has undergone a real change in where the consensus view is, where the institutional thinking is on some issues relating to trans rights, particularly when it comes to youth gender transitions. Tell us a little bit about the Hilary Cass report, which made big headlines around the world, strangely not as big headlines in some mainstream American news outlets, and which really seems set to change the consensus view shared by both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party in the United Kingdom about the appropriate approach to youth gender medicine.
So Hilary Cass is a very eminent paediatrician. She was a former president of the Royal Society of Paediatrics, and she was asked about 4 years ago by the government to look specifically at National Health Service treatment, so NHS treatment, and specifically for children in England and Wales. So that's basically one clinic, the clinic called GIDS, Gender Identity Development Services, at the Tavistock Clinic in London, because that's the one specialist service for the whole of England and Wales that looks at under 18s. And there have been worries about that service for years now. I mean, it's shocking to hear this, but the first whistleblower from that service was in 2004, a psychiatric nurse who was shocked to see 16-year-olds being given hormones after just 4 appointments, with what she thought was a terribly superficial discussion beforehand and very little explanation of what the long-term and permanent outcomes would be. And then there have been a series of whistleblowers. There was a court case with Keira Bell, really concern mounting that this was not a proper NHS facility held to the same standards as other sorts of healthcare, and in particular healthcare for children. And the government commissioned Hilary Cass to do a review.
Keira Bell, for those who don't know her, is somebody who transitioned from a biological female to a male gender identity when she was a teenager.
That's right. So she was at GIDS, but she actually aged out. So she was given treatment before she left. You know, the waiting lists are very long here. So she was actually seen by the adult services, but she very quickly went on to testosterone and had a double mastectomy, and then quite quickly regretted it. And Americans misunderstand what Keira's case was about. It wasn't an attempt to get compensation. She wasn't suing the clinic. She took a judicial review, which is a mechanism whereby you can challenge a legal authority, a public legal authority, which you say has not lived up to proper standards. And she actually won the court case saying that GIDS had not been operating as it should have been, and then it was overturned at the High Court. So the judgment didn't stand, but the evidence that came out during the hearing was really quite shocking about the poor standards, the lack of care, the really lack of evidence base in the way that GIDS was operating. So the government picked that up and commissioned this review.
One very brief piece of advertisement. Persuasion published her first-person account. It was the first to publish her first-person account of her transition and why she came to regret it, and how it showed some of the shortcomings in this service. So if you Google
yes, that was great that you did that. You did that very early. Like that was what, 2 years ago?
Yes, something like that.
Yeah, the interim report came out about 2 years ago, in fact, from the Cass review, and already it was clear that it was going to be quite critical overall. We were hoping that, like those of us who are worried about the way that gender medicine proceeds, especially in paediatric clinics, were hoping that she would give further credence to the arguments we've been making for years, that this is not really medicine, that children are being subjected to an uncontrolled experiment on the basis of shoddy or no evidence, and she really said all of that. It's a magisterial piece of work which includes significant evidence reviews of the basis for paediatric gender medicine, and concludes that that basis is absolutely not where it should be for something that's been done for 20 plus years, and is also not sufficient to do interventions that have life-changing effects. So she concluded that there is no evidence one way or another whether or not puberty blockers, for example, which stop a child from going into their own sex's puberty, actually help with gender dysphoria. And since they have significant side effects, which can really railroad a child into an adulthood who is sterile, anorgasmic, not very clear on their own sexuality because they haven't been through puberty in the normal way, possibly with problems with their bones, possibly with problems with their brain development, all of those things with no evidence on the other side to show that it treats the thing it was meant to treat. And that's quite shocking. That should have been found out a lot earlier. That was the first big thing that came out of it.
So tell us a little bit more about those medical concerns, because, I understand the prima facie case for why you might want to have a gender transition early on, right? If people are severely gender dysphoric, if they feel deeply uncomfortable in the body the way that it is, and if they don't just wish to live as the other gender, but wish to pass as the other gender, then intervening early on makes a huge difference, right? So I can see the kind of initial case for why we should want people, even at a relatively young age, to have access to some of those treatments. The problem, of course, is that those treatments then come with severe medical risks and some foreseeable consequences like infertility in very many of those cases. So tell us a little bit about what's on the other side of that ledger, because the way it's often portrayed still in the United States is, if you're worried about youth gender medicine, then you must just be a bigot who hates trans people, who somehow finds the idea of people living as a different gender icky, or you're transphobe. Why is it that if you're actually concerned for the well-being of these troubled young people, you have reason to be skeptical about these youth gender transitions?
It's really interesting to hear you describe the rationale, because the thing is, the rationale has changed entirely at least twice in the period that they've been doing it. So the very first people who did it were in Amsterdam, a Dutch clinic, and their rationale wasn't anything like you described. What they believed was that there were such things as transsexual children, that there were people and that they could identify them. They didn't have any claim that they were giving a pause or anything like that. They thought they had found children who inevitably or nearly inevitably would continue to identify as members of the opposite sex, and they exclusively considered passing as their sole outcome. It's quite shocking when you read and listen to those people talking now. One of them was on a podcast relatively recently, very clearly thinking that these children were in such dire straits that nothing could be done for them very much. Like everything that happened to them in the way of sterility, shame about their genitals because you can't give people functioning genitals of the opposite sex, and their inability to form relationships and so on. All of that was just accepted, that these are the sort of people who can't have that. And the sole consideration was whether they would pass. And then the rationale changed to being about a pause button. Like that was not what these people said at all. They said, give people time to think. Give them time between when they're 11 or 12 and puberty is likely to start, and 16 when they could consent to something more extreme or permanent. But the thing is that what makes it resolve, what makes gender distress resolve, is that period between 12 and 16. It is learning to understand yourself as a sexual adult being and so on. And those two things are contradictory. You don't need time to think if you've identified the right people. If you haven't identified the right people, then you really need to be sure that people will desist during that period if they're not the right ones. But the thing is, nobody desists, really almost nobody. If you take puberty blockers, you're 98% likely, is the best evidence we have, to go on to cross-sex hormones. So when you choose puberty blockers, you are choosing cross-sex hormones, and those have permanent impact.
So and that's interesting, because it's a little bit different from how I understood the debate to be, so I'm learning something here, which is to say that I thought the debate, broadly speaking, was that people who are more critical of the current state of youth gender medicine argue that there's high levels of detransitioners like Kira Bell, or at least that we haven't excluded the possibility that there may be high levels of detransitioners like Kira Bell. So people who go down this path, have a medical intervention, and then come to regret it, and that people who are defending the current practices will say, no, that nearly never happens. Once you're down this path, people stick with it. But the way you're describing it is a slightly more subtle debate, which is to say that it's about when people desist. And what the defenders of youth gender medicine would say is, look, there's a bunch of people who go on puberty blockers, and when they decide, actually, I don't want to go through a cross-gender treatment, And so they stop taking the puberty blockers, and then they continue to have puberty in accordance with their biological sex. But then the people who do go through the cross-gender surgery or hormones, they don't desist, right? Whereas the argument on the other side is
some of them may.
Well, that's the argument that
Yes.
defenders of this are doing, right?
I see.
The argument people who are more critical are making is, well, the problem is that nobody desists when they're on puberty blockers, but then later in life they may come to desist. So actually, the disagreement is about the timing of desisting more than about its existing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that the people on the other side of the debate, for me, almost deny desistance entirely. They tend to cite a figure of 1% for desistance, and they will often say that's less than regret after keyhole knee surgery. I've learned all these talking points now. In fact, there have been very few proper studies of desistance. There's a big online survey that's quoted in America, but it doesn't make any attempt to have an unbiased sample. It's, write in, it doesn't check the data, you can fill it in several times. It explicitly says it's only for people who identify as trans currently, so it explicitly excludes anyone who thinks of themselves as detrans. But this is cited to say that there's very little transition. Or they look at the records of gender clinics and say there's hardly anyone on these records who's detrans, but people don't go back to tell their gender clinicians. There's been one study here in a centre which has looked at the records and found that 7% of people who went through that clinic had desisted in quite a short time frame. There was a fair amount of loss to follow up, and the time frame was short, and they said they were sure that was quite a considerable underestimate. So we can be sure that desistance is larger than the American cheerleaders for youth gender medicine. But I would also say that's not my objection exactly. It's true what you say. I do argue that to the extent that people say puberty blockers are a pause button, that's just false. Almost nobody stops on them. My point is that these are a very major intervention in a child's development at a very critical point. There are two major developmental sprints in life, and one of them is toddlerhood and the other one is puberty. And toddlerhood turns you from being someone who's entirely dependent to someone who can grow and learn. And puberty turns you into an adult. And a million trillion things happen during puberty to your brain and your body. We all know this. Anyone who's had children has seen it happen. I have two sons and they're both adults now. And that period, honestly, it looks like a fast forward of a tree growing overnight. The child gets up and they're an inch taller. It's amazing. And everything changes in your brain as well. It's when your bones get stronger. It's when you become independent, a whole bunch of things. And the idea that you would intervene in that period and just give it a chemical cosh, because that's what it is. It sounds like it's a little tweak to stop and delay puberty. It's actually a huge shutdown overnight of an entire endocrinological system. It's like putting somebody into menopause overnight. That you would do that, you would only do that if the thing on the other side of the scales was really big. And that, I'm afraid to say, is why American cheerleaders for youth gender transition talk about suicide so much. The thing they say is on the other side of the scales is child suicide. That also was not one of the early justifications. So that's why I say that there have been at least two total rewrites of the justification for puberty blockers. Now they say that if you don't give children these things, they will inevitably or nearly inevitably kill themselves. And that was the other really important thing that Hilary Cass said. She said, not only is there no evidence of that, it's not true. So that's been demolished. Puberty blockers are not a treatment for child suicidality. They do not reduce child suicide. The rate of child suicide among children who are severely gender distressed is higher than among the average child. It's still extremely low, and it's about the same as those with other children who are not gender distressed, who have the same mental health conditions, because children with gender distress do have a lot of mental health conditions. So she really demolished the entire basis for youth gender medicine.
So I want to come back to each of these points because I think they're both very important. So I'll circle back to the point about suicide. But first, as I'm understanding you're saying there's two separate kinds of arguments against puberty blockers, for example, right? So the first is that people who take puberty blockers then nearly always go on to take cross-gender hormones, and some percentage of those people may regret doing that, right? That's obviously a very strong argument because if we're doing this major intervention in order to accord with the wishes of a young person, but that young person then says later in life those wishes were in fact not as deep-seated as they thought, or they were mistaken in some kind of way, then we've potentially intervened in a serious way in the body and in the way to function in the world, and the ability to have children, for example, for no end, for no purpose. So that's very clear. You've clarified for me that there's a broader objection here, which is, well, even if people don't come to regret changing gender in that kind of way, there's still a question about whether it is acceptable to interfere in the process of puberty to such an extent, and whether, of course, 12, 13, 14-year-olds are able to consent to all of the kind of consequences that has. That is harder to think about, right? I mean, the detransition case is sort of easy, right? Like, obviously, people who end up detransitioning, something has gone wrong in a way, right? Like that is a pretty strong argument. Here, it feels like we're much more in the realm of trade-offs, where, I am very, very concerned about the kind of medical consequences that these treatments may have. I'm also very conscious of the fact that we don't really know yet fully what kind of consequences they have, because, for example, when you have a loss of bone density, which appears to be the case, that may not be a huge problem when you're 25 or 30, but it may come to be a giant problem once you're 60 or 70, and we simply haven't been making these kind of interventions long enough to know to what extent that is going to be a problem. But of course, I do also see what's on the other side here, which is to say that if somebody strongly feels that they want to live as the other gender and they do want to pass, that is a compelling interest. And it's just harder to think about how to balance those things. So how do you think about those cases? If we were somehow able to exclude all the detransitioners, we figured out a new protocol. Yeah. I understand this doesn't exist at the moment, perhaps it'll never exist, but let's imagine we figure out the protocol that just solves the detransition problem. We're not going to get false positives. We're not going to get false negatives. We have a perfect way to predict. How do you think the sort of balance of trade-offs ends up falling on the rest of those cases?
Yeah, great question. So we're imagining that we've identified the right kids and we accept that puberty blockers have potentially very negative consequences. Certainly some. I mean, if you go on puberty blockers at the beginning of puberty, straight onto cross-sex hormones, you will not just be infertile, you will be sterile. There will be no fertility to protect or to preserve. You will be anorgasmic probably, and you will probably not understand your own sexuality, therefore. So these are enormous things. These are the sorts of things that get called major human rights abuses when you look back at them in history. You would not do these things lightly. So I think fundamentally those are unethical things to even offer to a 10 or 11-year-old, because I don't think a 10 or 11-year-old can understand them, even if they say they can. And we saw this play out, in fact, in Keira Bell's initial hearing. So among the many shocking things that came out in we keep bad records, nobody's taking responsibility, we've no coherent standards across the clinic, they got the endocrinologist who the clinicians referred the children to, because obviously gender clinicians aren't endocrinologists, they refer for those hormones or those hormone blockers. And it turned out the clinic had given puberty blockers to 3 10-year-old girls, natal girls, and all 3... they had not done anything that you could call counselling on the consequences, in particular the consequences for fertility. And so when asked why, speaking for the endocrinologist, the lawyer said something that is a grotesque fantasy, which is that if those girls wanted to have babies when they were older that were their own physically, they could come off the puberty blockers around 14 for 6 months and go through a couple of cycles of egg harvesting once their ovaries had developed a bit, and that then they could freeze those eggs and they could use them in the future. And every part of that is sheer nonsense. The idea that a 10-year-old could understand what is involved in that. I've actually done IVF 3 times. Both my children are by IVF, so I've gone through egg collection. This is not something you could explain to a 10-year-old. It's hard to accept as an adult. The second thing is, who the hell is to carry these babies? If you take testosterone as a female person, your reproductive system is going to go through changes that require you to have your womb removed quite quickly. Testosterone is very bad for the uterus and for the vagina. It thins the skin, it causes bleeding, it causes a lot of pain. So you are putting yourself on a path to hysterectomy at age 10. And children of 10 don't typically know whether they want children, and they say silly things like, I'll just adopt. They don't know what adoption's like. We considered that when we were trying to have children. It's very hard, and it's not about you, it's about the child. So this entire thing is a fantasy, every bit of it. And they didn't tell those children any of that, but anyway, you can't. How can you explain to a 10-year-old you're never going to have an orgasm? It would be a totally inappropriate conversation. So I think fundamentally, even if you were identifying the right children, you would simply not be able to get informed consent at that age. And then the last thing I'd say is, why the rush on passing, especially for girls? It's true that a boy who goes through male puberty is going to struggle to pass as a female in adult life, because testosterone does very major things to the body. But women who take testosterone as adults have a much easier time passing as men, because they grow facial hair. If they've got the genes for balding, they go bald. They build up muscle, their voice breaks. All of these, by the way, are the reasons why it's very hard to detransition for a woman, much harder than it is for a man. So why? Why the rush? The only thing that really happens that you're going to have medical intervention to change is that your breasts grow. And I just don't see that that's something that you can weigh up against, you're going to lose your reproductive organs. It's a major operation to have a hysterectomy, even when it's being done to save your life. It's not easy. My mother had it in her 50s and she took a year to recover. This is not ethical. It's not an ethical thing to offer a 10-year-old, and they will not understand it.
As you were making the last point, I made a connection to, a set of questions and a set of literatures that I've never thought about in this context before. I'm a huge fan of the late Oxford philosopher Bernard Williams. And one of the points that Bernard Williams makes is that we like our ethics to be tidy. We like there to be the right course of action. And if you take the right course of action, there's no moral remainder. Right, all of the sums add up perfectly. You've done the right thing, and there's nothing on the other side of note. You can be 100% sure that you're in the clear. And he tried to argue for a sense of tragedy in moral decision making. One of the examples he gives is imagining that you're, hiking through the woods in some Latin American country. This slightly politically incorrect nature of this example, which is not meant to be politically incorrect, dates it somewhat. You come across, some military chief who's about to shoot 10 villagers, and he says, well, since you're a great honored guest in our country, if you take the gun and shoot one of the villagers, then we let the other 9 go. And so, there's questions here about consequentialism or deontological approaches about whether or not you should shoot the villager, but the broader point that this illustrates is that you kind of are going to have blood on your hands one way or the other, right? If you decide to shoot, you're the person who shot the villager. If you decide not to shoot, you're the person who is in some sense causally responsible or co-responsible for 9 additional people dying. And there's not going to be some way of getting out of that situation where you say, I'm 100% satisfied with the decision I make and I have no form of regret at all. I wonder whether a little bit of a sense of moral tragedy would help us in this debate. Because I do think that, when a young person is in severe gender dysphoria, right, and when it is so important to them to pass. And I take your very interesting point about the difference here between male to female transition and female to male transition. But I see the point on the other side, right? On the other hand, very clearly, the medical consequences of transitioning at that age, as you've laid out, are extremely serious as well. Now, you can end up thinking that the costs are higher on one side than the other. And I think you make a strong case that, the cost to becoming infertile, to becoming inorgasmic, to losing bone density and all of those things may be higher than those on the other side. But I wonder whether this debate would just be more humane and more mutually respectful if we just recognize that there's always going to be moral remainder. That there's a moral remainder if we deny gender transition to young people, but there's certainly also a moral remainder if we give them cross-sex hormones and, they end up with all of these medical consequences that you've described.
I fundamentally don't see it in that framework at all. I see it as... I think the reason is that you, unlike me, you think that there are really some kids that it's best to understand as trans, that they're people who really will benefit from this treatment. I think that is at least questionable. So the main way that people think of that is they think, some kids say that they're happy and never detransition and never regret it. But regret is an incredibly slippery concept. People rarely are able to bear the pain of crystallizing regret for decisions that have had very significant and irreversible consequences. So we don't, all of us, go around the place regretting having got married and think to ourselves there were 3 billion other people we could have married or anything like that. You have to commit to decisions, even if they end up being a bit imperfect. And that is very true, and we know that. There's a lot of studies of regret after medical treatment. It's just not the right framework, regret and detransition. What you need to do is to look at what that person would have been like had they not done this treatment. And that means that you have to have control groups. So suppose you have somebody who goes through all of this very serious transition and comes out of it and says, I'm happy. I'm happy presenting as a woman or presenting as a man. And they go on to live the rest of their lives. The fact is they're living the rest of their lives quite significantly disabled by the treatment that they've had, in particular sterile, and possibly many other things too. But that person might also have been happy if they had gone ahead, because the process of puberty resolves most gender distress. We've known that for decades. So they're stopping going through the process that would have resolved it in the most natural and happy way. But we haven't done those studies with control groups, and the clinics have really resisted that. We haven't even done follow-up that's longer than about 18 months. The very few studies on desistance tend to be about 18 months. And we know from people who have been working in this field with adults for longer that it's typically 10 years or more before somebody really says, if they're ever going to say it, this was all a big mistake. And you've forgotten a couple of other things too. One of them is, it's not true that you can change sex. And adults, sophisticated adults, tend to make a distinction between sex and gender and to say that you're going through a gender transition, you're presenting as the opposite sex, you're living in the gender role or something like that. Children don't hear that. They think that you're promising them that they can change sex. I've seen videos of children in gender clinics, little children who have already socially transitioned, and it's little boys dressed as girls, very, very much happier dressed as girls, because these are little boys who really wanted to be girls. And they say things like, I want to be a mother, I want to have my own babies. And they're too little to understand. They think the adults are telling them the truth, that they actually can be girls. And they can't. I mean, I would love to wave my wand and make it possible to change sex. It would be very interesting for all of us, but we can't do it. And, that confusion goes up into teenage years and adulthood because children are being missold this in schools as well. Things like the genderbread person. Sophisticated adults are saying, in the back of their mind, they're saying they do know that sex is binary and immutable. But up front, what they're telling children is that you can be whoever you want to be. You can be a girl if that's who you think you are. Your true self is a thing. This is selling a bill of goods. And it is immoral to be doing it. And then the last thing that you're forgetting in your framework in which you're imagining that there really are some trans children is other people. The promise that those gender clinicians, the unspoken promise, and sometimes spoken, is that if you go through all of this, the world will accept you as a member of the opposite sex. But everybody won't. Some of them can't for the sake of their own rights. So there are people, many, many people, probably a majority of people, who think that sex is real and does matter. So, for example, in sport, if you go through a gender transition, no matter how early you go through it, even if you don't go through male puberty, part of the male sporting advantage is prepubescent. Baby boys are born heavier. They're born about 10% heavier, or maybe 5%, I forget the exact figure. They're more active, they're stronger, their muscles are bigger, their joints are less mobile, their tendons carry more energy. They're stronger even before puberty. So you can't be let into women's sport. We cannot do it. But the unspoken promise is A, we can, and B, everybody will accept it, even if it's a pretense. So what if they don't? What if you get out of all of this, you've gone through it, you've been made sterile, you've had the operations that are major, you've got these long-term consequences for your bones and your brain, and after all of that, people still say, sorry, you're not a woman, or sorry, you're not a man. I mean, they will do that in bed anyway. Like, very, very few people think that a surgically altered member of the opposite sex, no matter how well altered, actually matches them for their sexuality if they're heterosexual, and, mutatis mutandis for same sex. So you're promising something that you can't deliver when you do this. That's the fundamental problem I have with it, more than any of the consequential problems. It's just not something we can do. I've increasingly started to see it as something like selling eternal youth. Like, it would be lovely if we could do it, but it was just a lie. We can't.
Let's circle back for a moment to the point about suicide. So you're right, this has become an increasingly large portion of the rhetoric, certainly in the United States. We had a piece in Persuasion about Nex Benedict, a teenager in Oklahoma who committed suicide. And this is widely ascribed, including by the president, at least implicitly, to them being transgender and perhaps being bullied for it. The actual facts of the case seem much more complicated than that. This is obviously a very understandable concern, especially if you're a parent to children who are gender dysphoric. The idea that they might be at this highly elevated risk of suicide understandably scares people deeply. Why is it that this talking point, in your view, is erroneous? What is the evidence that this is simply a mistaken way of thinking, both about the actual risk that these gender dysphoric young people are at of suicide and how best to counteract that risk?
So I don't know about the States, but certainly in the UK, any death of an under 18, an unexpected death, like whether that's a murder or a suicide or some other, like a car accident or whatever, is automatically given, like added to a particular record and investigated. So we actually have pretty much perfect figures on suicides of under 18s. And Hilary Cass looked at them, and it is simply not true. It is just not true that there is a very elevated risk among the children who are, seen by gender clinics or whatever. Obviously, there are lots of kids who identify as trans, but no doctor ever finds out about that. They socially transition and they haven't even been to their family doctor. It's quite common now, especially if you include non-binary. But there just aren't a lot of child suicides, thankfully. So it's never been plausible, as the number of kids who identify as trans has increased, has rocketed, has multiplied by thousands of %, that this is a serious driver of suicide, because the figures just don't add up. It's very, very, very important not to talk about it like that as well. What the suicide charities and helplines say is never attribute suicide to a single motivation, because it never is one. It never is one thing. And it's called the young Werther effect, isn't it? That you say, oh, people who have these characteristics are suicidal and they kill themselves this way, and suddenly everybody's doing that thing. So you don't describe suicide methods, you don't describe characteristics, you don't suggest that the world would be better off without them, or any of those things. And here we are doing all of that. So to the extent that there is an increase in suicidality, which there is no evidence of, I know who to blame. It's the people who peddle the suicide narrative. But the other thing to remember is just that these children typically have comorbidities. They have other conditions. One of my colleagues at Sex Matters, where I work, Michael Biggs, who's on the board, has done an interesting study looking at the children on the waiting list for the Tavistock, because it's quite long. And compared with the average children for their own age, they do have a little bit of an elevated risk. Like, it might be twice as high, I can't remember the exact figure, but of course it's on a very tiny base. But if you look at what we know about those children being autistic spectrum disorder, being same-sex attracted, that's a very high. That's, one of the more obvious ones of increasing suicide risk, as it happens still, being same-sex attracted. It all disappears. There's no reason to think this. So I think they do it because you need to have a motivation for doing what people instinctively understand to be a very major intervention in a child's life. There's a moral intuition about children that stands entirely separate from the calculus about cost-benefit, who's going to pass, what trans rights actually means. what do man and woman mean? And that moral calculus or that moral intuition is simply they're too young. They're just too young. And people, I mean, we can talk a bit about which talking points work and which ones don't, and what people think when they say that they're supporting trans rights. But typically, anyone who has a child or knows children typically feels that when you say children are going to make consequential decisions, they just say too young, wait. No tattoos, no joining the army, wait. And that's that, you can't get past that actually with people. And I think it's a good intuition. And so to get past that, you have to put this into the realm of childhood cancer. That is really where they're trying to position it when they talk about suicide. The only reason that you would risk a child's brain development, bone development, consign them to sterility, make sure that they won't have a happy sex life, would be that they're going to die of cancer otherwise. And then you would give them chemo or radio. So they're saying they will die. That's the only thing that can possibly go on this side of the scales if you're going to start doing that balancing act.
Yeah, and one of the things that I do find striking in general in this current moment of discourse is a tendency to catastrophize about the world in pursuit of social justice. And we see that in other kinds of areas as well. Playing up the kinds of dangers that members of all kinds of minority groups face. And I get the instinct behind that, which is the more we talk about it, the more people will understand the genuine forms of discrimination and injustice that exist, and then it'll motivate people to go and fight against them. That is kind of implicit psychological political theory that is driving that. But I can't help notice how blithely we often risk instilling genuine fears in people, and perhaps even leading to genuinely bad consequences in the process of that. So if you tell people that every time they step out into the street they're at risk because people hate them so much, that will very understandably lead a lot of people to grow to be deeply anxious about their interactions with the world in a way that has very, very negative consequences for them. And if the statistics are as you describe, and the risk of suicidality is not what these activists claim, the people advancing that point should really think about how much fear they are instilling in parents and in children in a way that presumably does genuine harm to them.
I think I'm more cynical than you. I don't think your description of their motivation is correct. I think it's moral blackmail. I think in all these cases, it's people saying my cause is so important that you must accept all of it as a full package, 100%. And if you speak against it, you're a bad person. And that requires really inflated rhetoric. You have to be the worst sort of bigot, and the outcomes have to be catastrophic. And they really lose credibility by doing this because hardly anything is like this. But you are so right about the negative consequences for the kids. It's something that's really, really upsetting me at the moment because rightly, the consequence of the Cass review has been basically a halt on any new prescriptions of puberty blockers for under 18s, actually in Scotland as well, even though they have a separate regime and a separate clinic. Scottish children aren't that different from... Scottish puberty is not different from English puberty, shall we say. And they're really trying to crack down on it going private as well, because this is not an ethical treatment. That's what we said. This is not an ethical treatment. We should not be doing it. But think of the kids who've been sold it as the thing that's going to save their lives. There are kids on waiting lists, thousands of them, who have fixated, understandably enough, because of the narrative, on this thing as the thing that is literally going to save their lives. And now they're being told that this awful demon, Hilary Cass, doesn't want them to have it. Of course they think she's a transphobe. Of course they're despairing. These poor families and these poor children. It was a grossly unethical bit of moral blackmail, and it's coming back to bite precisely the people that those activists would say they represented.
So here's something that I find very interesting about the developments in the United Kingdom, which is that you now have what appears to me from the outside to be a relatively broad political and institutional consensus that has really transformed over the course of the last 5 or 10 years. The government has accepted the main findings of the Cass review, but so has the government in waiting. The Labour Party, which is likely to be in power after the next election, if current opinion polls are to be believed, has similarly signalled its support for the main findings of the Cass review. We have seen similar developments in a number of other European countries, including, for example, some of the Scandinavian countries, many of the countries that are broadly seen, I think rightly seen, as being some of the most progressive and socially liberal countries in Europe, have had a real institutional change of mind on these issues. I think it would be hard to argue that this is motivated by Sweden, for example, being particularly full of transphobes relative to other countries in Europe. It does seem to be based on some of the new evidence that has come out. The one very obvious outlier in the international scene is the United States, where this debate continues to be highly polarized, and a huge swath of the journalistic establishment, the political establishment, continues to defend the position that, for example, the British Labour Party has moved away from. Both when you look at the thrust of coverage in mainstream outlets like NPR or the New York Times or the Washington Post, it is now very different from where the main journalistic consensus seems to lie in the United Kingdom. And of course, when you look at the institutional position of the Democratic Party, it is now light years away from where the British Labour Party lies. Why is that?
I mean, you sort of said it with polarization. This issue has become part of the Democratic package on one whole set of issues and part of the Republican package in the exact reverse. So if you are a typical woman in the UK who feels strongly that there has been overreach in the trans campaign and that you think that gender medicine has really lost its way, you're actually typically left-wing. You call yourself a feminist, you're active in the Labour Party. The women who have been leading all of this are left-wing women here. And then those women are not saying, get rid of abortion, we need to go back to traditional gender roles, men should be men and women should be women. Very much not that. They're saying the opposite. They're saying women can be whoever they want to be, men can be whoever they want to be. Don't let your biology hold you back. It's just a fact about life, like being born and dying.
And indeed, just as a side note, one very weird part of the discourse among certain transgender activists in the last years has been this strange resurrection of very restrictive gender norms, right? Where people are told, if you're a girl but you like, playing sports, then perhaps you're really kind of male. And if you're a boy but you like playing with dolls, then perhaps really you're a girl, which is the sort of most simplistic version of that argument, but one that is quite widespread.
Yes, and it's the only one that you can give to children. So I can imagine that an adult would mean something very hard, possibly impossible to express by saying, I've always felt I was really a woman. I've always felt I was really a man. I mean, the best evidence that I've seen and the best evidence that I found when I was writing my book dates from a review paper around 2000 that looked at the development of gender distress and concluded that gender nonconformity came first and gender distress only developed if gender nonconformity was stigmatised. So a little boy who was shamed by his dad for being a sissy is somebody who's at risk of deciding one day, looking around him and saying, I really wish I was a girl. I was meant to be a girl. Why am I this way? So we knew that already in 2000. In countries where people who are enormously atypical for their sex are able to fit into a sort of a third gender role that is not stigmatised, they tend to do that and they typically don't feel any distress about it. So the Fa'afafine in Samoa, who are these men, the words mean in the manner of a woman. They're men who dress as women, but they don't take sort of hormonal or surgical interventions and they aren't called women. They don't find this distressing. They don't find their sexed body distressing. They just regard themselves as not typical men. So the gender distress is something that we create by stigmatising extreme gender dysphoria or extreme gender nonconformity, in most occasions. But still, I can imagine an adult saying something that they find impossible to explain and a bit ineffable, like it's a bit like trying to explain what you mean when you say you feel the presence of God or something. I as an atheist can't understand it, but I'm willing to say, you feel something, I don't understand it. For a child, however, to teach this in a classroom, if you look at the genderbread person or any of these teaching materials, they will say, your gender identity is in your brain. Your sex is in your genitals, they typically say. In fact, your sex is right through your body. It's in every cell. And then they will talk about gender expression as being about clothes and stereotypes and interests and so on. And they say that these are three separate things. But there's no way to explain what the gender identity might be except by going via the the expression. Like, you're not allowed to go via the actual sex. You can't say, well, your gender identity is female if your sex is female, because we're specifically trying not to say that in this paradigm. So all you end up saying to children is, if you feel like a girl, you must be a girl. That's what you are. Well, how do you know you feel like a girl? And then we're back at dolls and ironing and liking pink and princesses and so on. So there just is no way to teach it that doesn't go via the stereotypes. And I've seen studies, in fact, of children's books that look at all the ones that are presented by trans lobby groups to schools. And it's really all about the clothes and the hair and what they like. Like, I Am Jazz starts with, I like swimming, I like football, which is soccer, which is, of course, for Americans, is a girl's sport. I wanted to be a mermaid. Pink was my favourite colour, da-da-da. That means that I have a girl brain and a boy body. And that's what children hear, and children believe adults. So that's what they think it means.
So to return to the difference between the United States and the United Kingdom, it was hard to imagine the United Kingdom ending up where it is right now. 4 or 5 years ago, I imagine. It felt like a big challenge to overcome, at least. It feels very hard to imagine that NPR and the Democratic Party might change their mind about some of these highly polarized stances that they're currently taking. How much hope do you think there is for that? And what would it take to move where the sort of mainstream consensus is on these issues in a more differentiated and subtle direction?
Yeah, it's a subtle question with a few parts to it. I mean, I think it's impossible to overstate the role that Brexit played in all of this. Like, happenstance is so important in politics. We would have got gender self-ID in 2018 along the most extreme versions that you have in American states, except that Brexit distracted everybody. And it just didn't quite make it over the line as the governments were having chaos and new prime ministers and all that stuff. And the thing is that popular consensus, popular opinion moves one way on this issue, basically, and that is towards more scepticism about the claims of the trans lobby. And you can see that including in America. So once you don't get over the hill of having legal gender self-ID at the high watermark, dreadful mixed metaphor there, forgive me, you are able to drag it back. And then if you haven't changed the law, you can work in a more step-by-step way. Whereas if you have a law change, you're going to have a big fight over a law, and that always takes a lot, and it's 20 years to undo any crappy law, And then the other thing is this polarization. Like, it is just not true that there's a consensus in America. There just isn't. There are two consensuses. And those consensuses have very different characteristics to them. If I can compare it with the UK, what we understand from focus groups and from polling, ours and other people's, is that support for trans rights is what you might call a mile wide and an inch deep. People tend to say, I support people being who they are. I support adults. They will often spontaneously say adults, saying who they are. They know themselves best. Adults can make these decisions for themselves. It's rude to misgender. They aren't happy to allow children to do anything that they regard as irreversible, and they don't want children taught lies, and they understand sport as a special issue. Really, almost nobody supports men and women's sports, even if those men identify as women, under any circumstances. But the rest of it, it's very unthinking, this support. And the more you question them, the more you say, well, remember that most trans women are just normally physiologically male. Remember that you might be locked in a cell with somebody in a prison overnight with no guards around. Remember that an 8-year-old girl might go into the changing room in a local swimming pool on her own, and there might, the showers might be communal. When you say these things, people become more and more sceptical very quickly. So it all just moves one way. It's an inch deep. And that's actually true whether or not people come in saying trans rights are human rights, trans women are women, or they come in saying, oh, this trans thing has gone too far, it's political correctness gone mad. It still moves in the sceptical direction as you question them. So I would be very interested to know how that would play out in America, where, I think Republicans are mostly already there on the sort of sceptical front. They've had these thoughts and it's easier for them to say them. And because it's easier for them to say them, they hear them more. Whereas that people have dug in on the left and they don't get a chance to hear them. I have friends who are American and who would have called themselves liberal and, would be lifelong Democratic voters. And they tell me about conversations with friends of theirs that they agree with on, I've always agreed with on really nearly everything, that they campaigned with, they did reclaim the night marches, and, abortion, everything like this. And they explain and they talk for hours and they say all their issues about how regressive it is and children and sport and da-da-da. And then it's the next time they see this person, it's as if, it's the eternal sunshine of the spotless mind. Like not one bit of it sank in. And the reason it can't is because if it sinks in, you will be seeing something that you can't unsee. And you now will have to act or speak. So it's important because if you act or speak, there will be major professional and personal consequences for you. So people cannot hear it. We're now in a real dilemma where a large number of Americans, for very good reason, cannot hear what I'm saying. And I don't know how that plays out.
Yeah, a few thoughts on that. The first is that certainly there is a lot of preference falsification. And I know that from people I've had conversations with. And that, of course, leaves open the possibility of preference cascade, which is to say that when something, the permission structure changes, suddenly people reveal how they actually feel about this. The second is that more in common in the United Kingdom, I think, had a good study on questions about trans issues. And they found, I might phrase it slightly differently, but something similar to you, which is to what you were saying.
Yes, we've talked to them, and you're exactly right. Like I'm describing in part their research here.
Right, and so broadly speaking, I think that's true in the United States as well. People are very sympathetic to those who struggle with gender identity. They certainly think that it's a free country, and part of it being a free country means dress as you like, present yourself as you like. By and large, for that's perhaps a little bit more controversial, people feel that if you have a preference to be addressed in a particular kind of way, I will choose to indulge that. For I think they're much more skeptical about any form of punishment for not doing that, which is a very different kind of thing, which I, on free speech ground, am also much more skeptical of, for example. But then when it comes to questions like sports, when it comes to questions like women's shelters or prisons, that is where the resistance to the more extreme reaches of a trans lobby comes in very strongly. What do you think would be a more healthy movement for trans rights? Which is to say that, when you speak to people, and I've made this point a number of times on this podcast, like Andrew Sullivan or Jonathan Rauch, who were really, among the first to argue for same-sex marriage, for example. They described that they first had to win a fight within their own movement to turn that into a universal struggle, right? Whereas people within the gay rights movement said, I don't want to get married, that's a bourgeois, hetero institution, we want to revolutionize society, right? And people like Andrew Sullivan, Jonathan Rauch had to win those debates internally to say, no, that is both wrong on the merits. There's something positive about the special recognition that a lifelong bond between two people gets from the state and society. And it's wrong in terms of how we're going to make advances on gay rights, right? The way we're going to win this is to say, we're like you, our love is like yours, why are we being excluded from this? I think one of the things that's gone wrong within this debate is that the anti-universalist, more extreme side has won within the trans rights movement, which I think is connected to a broader set of changes in our culture and the kind of receptivity to those kind of universalist causes. But there is surely a core of a trans movement which is legitimate. I mean, certainly when I think about the kind of mockery of trans people that was very mainstream 15 or 20 years ago, fighting against that and fighting for greater recognition of the struggles and difficulties that people with gender dysphoria face is genuinely an important cause. The problem with it is not that they've identified an injustice that we're fighting against. The problem is that that cause has been captured by an extreme position that is anti-universalist in key respects and therefore incapable of therefore both makes genuine mistakes about how society should be organized, but also becomes incapable of actually capitalizing on the genuine sympathy that by now most people in these opinion polls and in these focus groups actually have for trans people, which is the reason why people get negatively polarized. So they say, well, hang on a second. If accepting trans people means that I'm supposed to also accept A and B and C and D and E, well, then I'm not so sure about the original premise, right? So what would, according to you, a more philosophically liberal, universalist trans movement look like?
I think it would look like something that the people who lead what is currently called the trans movement aren't looking for, is the problem. So you can have, consequentialist theories about why gay marriage is a bad idea if you want. You can say that's just not what marriage is, it's about children, or something like that if you want. It's pretty hard to argue that a same-sex couple marrying has large and measurable and direct consequences that are unavoidable for other people. Like, you have to make arguments about the whole of society or something like that if you want to make an argument that it's harming other people. The thing about
what about earthquakes,
being a man... Say again?
What about earthquakes? What about all the earthquakes that are caused by gay marriages? I'm joking.
Exactly.
Those are some of the arguments that were made, right?
Yeah, plagues of locusts. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I can't even begin there. I can't even go down that route. But if you want to say that what the trans rights movement, which I would distinguish from people who identify as trans, by the way, many of the people I think of as the leaders of the trans rights movements are not even trans-identifying. They're the people who run organisations like the ACLU and HRC in America and Stonewall here. Often they're people who are gay and who, the movement, their organisation became taken over as a trans rights organisation, and they stayed.
And sorry to interrupt you there, but I think that's a very important point. And there's two thoughts here, right? And the first is that there's a big literature in political science about how institutions will always try to preserve their size and their influence. And part of what happened, in fact, is that institutions that were built for the fight for gay marriage, once the gay rights movement proved to be phenomenally successful in a way we should all celebrate, despite the earthquakes, then should have reduced the budgets and said, look, thank you to all of our donors. We've had this wonderful victory. We now only need a third of our size and a third of our staff. But of course, that's not what any institution will do. And these organizations are not unique in this. And so they needed to find a new issue. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of the leaders of this movement aren't necessarily trans. They're the leaders of the historical gay rights movement. The other thing that I think is very important here is that, when it comes to certain forms of identity politics that I've written about, one of the most common mistakes is to think that quote-unquote wokeness is somehow the organic ideology of African Americans in the United States, because that is the claim that is often made on behalf of that ideology, both by the black representatives of that ideology, but much more broadly by highly educated white people who dominate the media and appear on television, who say that is what people of color really want. And of course, you look at opinion polls, and that is not at all what people of color in general want. It's not at all specifically what African Americans want, most of whom are in no way woke. And so I think it's very important to point out that, a lot of trans people are just caught in the crossfire here, right? They just want basic levels of acceptance. They want to be able to go through their lives and feel accepted and respected by society, and they're not asking for these organizations to make maximalist claims on their behalf that then lead to all of that social polarization.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are plenty of people who just kind of want to fade into obscurity, not feel as miserable as they did, hopefully feel happy, feel safe, all of those things that everybody wants. So when I talk about the trans rights movement, I'm specifically talking about a political agenda. And that political agenda is to downplay or even deny the existence of binary sex and to prioritise entirely a self-declared gender identity. And that is not something that you can do for just the small minority of people in the same way that you can do gay marriage. I mean, I'm a married heterosexual person. It just didn't change my marriage when gay marriage was introduced. I can't think of any way that it did. I suppose you could philosophically say it kind of did, but, it just didn't. Whereas if I change the law so that a man can identify as a woman and then get whatever it is that was formerly restricted to only women, then that changes every woman's experience of being a woman, because it means there are no longer any women-only spaces. And women-only spaces are an essential part of keeping women safe. It's our freedom of association. It's our privacy. You know, all the figures that hopefully we don't have to rehearse on this particular podcast, but that I surprisingly often do have to rehearse on the differences between the sexes in terms of predilection for crime, the differences in strength, the differences in aggression. You know, men commit most violent and sexual crimes. Women are the victims of most of the sexual crimes. All of these things. You know, women participating fully in public life really does require that we are able to say no men here on occasion. But if men can identify as women and the law sees them as women and women are not able to say, I'm sorry, I don't see you as a woman, then all women cannot have women-only spaces, and that's quite big. So it's a very different sort of demand from saying gay people should be able to have the same age of consent for sex, be able to marry on the same terms. And if, to the extent that they insist on what's called gender self-identification, meaning that the law follows what you say you are, then that is a totalizing claim. It's like a religious claim because it's not based on any physical thing in the objective world that all of us can agree on, even in theory. It's a belief claim. It's just an inner state, and it's an inner state that they're requiring everybody else goes along with. So it is like a state or a totalitarian religion. And I don't see how that can be accommodated in a liberal or pluralistic society, and I don't even see how it can be compromised with, because if one side says, I demand that everybody sees me as a man or a woman according to what I say I am, and the other side says, I have problems, the answer can't be halfway between. It's a fight to the death between those two. One side will win and one side will lose.
Let me see where there might be a compromise position, right? So I acknowledge that there's obviously some areas where there's just a genuine decision to be made, and the choices seem relatively stark. So, either you allow a biological male who's transitioned to a female gender identity to compete in women's sports, or you don't. Either you admit such a person to a women's shelter, or you don't. But there may be a way of having some form of gender self-ID without those consequences. So I saw with mild concern that the German government recently passed a gender self-ID law. And I thought, for the reasons that you outlined in the British case, that would short-circuit an important debate and potentially set the country down the wrong path. But when I looked into it, and I haven't looked into it closely enough to be fully confident of what I'm saying, but my best understanding of the law as I'm speaking is that this refers, for example, to how you are described in your passport, to the way in which the government will address you, and other kinds of things. But the law also explicitly says that women's shelters, for example, are entitled to make their own decisions about who to admit. And so that is simply decentralized, and each women's shelter in its own right can make a decision about whom they count as a woman. And so this looks something that to me seems at first blush like a reasonable compromise to say, look, if people want the passport to list the gender identity in the way that they see it, let's make that easy for them. They don't have to go through some very complicated process. But that doesn't mean that we're restricting the rights of women's shelters, for example, to make their own decisions about who should be reasonably admitted. Is that sort of one part of a possible compromise? Does that seem to you like the outline of a reasonable way of running society?
It's basically what we have here in the UK, in that we have a Gender Recognition Act that dates from 2004, and it changes your legal sex for some but not all purposes. And the purposes are ones to do with the government. It's, for example, what it would say on your marriage cert. And it was explicitly said at the time in the debate in Parliament that it didn't have an impact on individuals. Like, people stood up and said, well, what about the wife of the man who transitions? Is she meant to pretend that she married a woman? It was like, no, of course it doesn't override history, and individuals can have their own freedom of speech and conscience and so on. Sadly, it hasn't actually played out like that. The practice went a long way away from the law, and a woman who says, that's fine, the government says that you're a woman in some circumstances, I don't, will find that she faces consequences. The thing about the passports, it would make more sense to me than falsifying the passport to take off the gender marker entirely, because the reason for the gender marker, people don't think these things through. The reason why we bother to say M and F on passports and on driving licenses is that the person who's most likely to steal your passport from you and use it is the person who lives with you, the other adult who lives with you. So a woman's passport or a woman's driving licence could be used by her husband. For example, if the husband had points on his driving licence, he'd been drunk or something like that, if there was no gender marker. But now we have pictures and we have thumbprints and we have iris recognition and facial recognition when you go through airports. Like, that's all just obsolete. So if there are people who are really very uncomfortable with the fact that they are being identified as male or female, and let's remember most of us can tell pretty much all of the time, but if they are uncomfortable, I'm fine with accommodating them to the extent that it's them. It's the same as thinking about a space where there are people who are Orthodox Jewish or who need consideration for halal food, you know, or how do you think about Jehovah's Witnesses and blood transfusions? You know, there are people who need accommodation is the right way to think about it. And we can do an awful lot more of the data type stuff, like the paperwork type stuff now with digital identities. I think that the right starting point is that the idea, like this package of transition to a female gender identity or transition to a male gender identity, it's both over and under determined. And I think that the question is, what do you want to do? And does that impact on other people's rights? Or is it something that's properly seen as in your own domain? Or indeed, does it impact on other people's rights, but in a way that we can find a way to accommodate it? So, I mean, there can only be a finite list of things that somebody who identifies as trans needs us to consider accommodating. Like, I think it would be very cruel to put a man who's semi-passing or passing as a woman to tell him to go and use the men's toilets for exactly the same reason that women don't want to use the men's toilets. They're not very safe for people who are gender non-conforming men or women. So we are going to have more third spaces. And that's the right answer there. Like the F sign over the door or the woman sign over the door really has to continue to mean only women. You're making a declaration when you go in there that you are genuinely female. But there's somewhere else for you to be. You're not locked out of permanent public life. So when we started to talk about transition back in the 1930s, 40s, a little bit before the Second World War, and then again more in America in the 70s, 80s, we were much, much more gender constrained. Like there were actual cross-dressing laws in Germany in the 20s and 30s, and there were cross-dressing laws in some American states until the 70s and 80s as well. There were jobs that were for men and for women, and they were advertised that way. There were rules about who you could marry. There were different pension ages, all sorts of things. The world was very gendered. And you couldn't just say, you do you, where would you like, etc., etc. But now we've got rid of all of those things. So to a much greater extent, you can say, you do you. You can't insist that other people go along with it. And there are certain costs that you can't require other people to bear. It's just too much of an imposition. But there are some that, like we all bear a bit of cost because some people are disabled. Like, if you have disabled parking slots, everybody else is a bit less in the way of parking spaces. That's fine. That's a civilized society. So stop thinking about, somebody transitioning to the opposite gender or something like that and think, here is a person who, for whatever reason, is telling me that living in every respect according to the standard package of ways that people of their sex live is distressing for them. And then see how we can accommodate them. I mean, I'll just say one thing about the passports thing. One of the things that happens when you go through an airport is you get searched, or at least you may get searched. And you have to think about other people's rights in these situations too. So just because a man says he's a woman doesn't mean that the woman who's working on security wants to pat his genitals down. It just doesn't. This is an imposition on her. So you have to treat this person in the same way that you might treat somebody who's wearing a burqa or who's pushing a baby buggy or who says to you, for whatever reason, I need to go separately to be examined. Maybe they've got, a pacemaker or a colostomy bag or something. There's a whole load of people who need special consideration in airports, and this person will need special consideration. They may not want to be patted down by a man, but the woman who pats them down will have to have consented to that beforehand. She'll have to have agreed that she's fine to do that. And there are women who are willing to do that. It's fine. We just have to think it through. What are all the situations? What are all the needs? Where are the rights in all these situations? So I think thinking about it like a religion is the best way to think about it. This person has a set of beliefs. It's a set of beliefs about themselves and possibly about the world. We will accommodate it maximally because we are a pluralistic, secular society. But we are not going to require everybody to buy into a belief system that they don't hold, and we're not going to impose costs on other people that they haven't accepted and that are outsize. So your example of the shelters being able to choose, we in effect have that here, but they all choose to be trans-inclusive, to allow men in who say that they're women, because they don't get funding if they don't. They come under a lot of pressure from trans activists. It's a sector where everything is on a shoestring anyway. Like, they tend to be, up to 40 different funding streams, not be able to see more than 2 years into the future. And so they just can't take stands. We actually need to be able to say, as a society, as a government, as policymakers, we know that women who are in recovery from male domestic violence and male sexual violence need single-sex spaces. We are going to provide them. We also know that men who identify as women do experience outsized amounts of violence. Homophobic men, transphobic men, whatever you want to call them, they too need help, but it's going to be specialised help, which it is actually. It's a very specialised thing. If somebody's, a trans woman who experiences domestic or sexual violence is not somebody who's going to be helped very easily by somebody who's trained on women, because their entire life history is different, their vulnerabilities are different. So we just think about all the people, the needs, the rights, the claims, and the trade-offs, rather than thinking of a package that we call transition.
Your point about how society has changed in terms of a role that gender plays in it over a number of decades has made a little light go off in my brain, which is another analogy to the debates about race in the United States. So one claim that's frequently made is that race is a social construct, which broadly speaking I agree with. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. But one of the real peculiarities of the consequences that what I call the identity synthesis, broadly speaking wokeness, has taken from that is that therefore we should make and aspire to make race a bigger part of our society, right? So if you recognize that race is in certain key respects a social construct, you might either take the consequence of that Karen and Barbara Fields did, which is to say, therefore, let's think less in categories of race. We obviously want to be aware that racism exists and want to study that. We don't want to be racism blind. We want to aspire to a society where the color of your skin determines much less about your opportunities and the way you're treated and the way we treat each other and the way we interact with each other and so on and so forth. But strangely, it has, in the sort of bulk of the woke tradition, led to people saying, therefore, we should go and encourage children to think of themselves as racial beings, and that's part of what a progressive education is. I think there's a kind of similar point here where the claim that I know you're much more skeptical of, and I don't think there's a perfect analogy here to something like race, that gender is a social construct, might have led people to say, well, therefore, let's create a society that is much less gendered. Right, therefore, let's keep pushing the direction that I guess second wave feminists pushed in and say, hey, we want a society in which whether you're male or female doesn't determine whether you're allowed to play soccer or American football, whether you're allowed to wear jeans or a dress, whether you're allowed to enter this or that profession. Right, let's try to create a society in which even physical spaces are perhaps less gender segregated. So there's more third spaces, there's more single-use bathrooms, there's more optionality for everybody, right? And instead, in a somewhat parallel movement, the strange thing is that the very people who believe that gender is fully socially constructed also go on to want a society in which gender actually determines practically everything, except with the sort of footnote that people can change their gender self-identity to fit into the other team, as it were. But the imaginary of that world is very segregated. There needs to be a male bathroom and a female bathroom, and the trans person needs to be able to have access to, the bathroom of the gender they identify with, as opposed to imagining a world in which gender just structures our social reality less in general.
It's odd, isn't it? The whole thing is odd. It's such a scavenger sort of movement that trying to say how consistent it is always very difficult. Like it's as if what is it they say? History doesn't repeat, it rhymes. It's a bit like that. These are rhyming movements rather than consistent or written across movements from one to the other. I mean, I think that sex is a hell of a lot realer than race. It's one of the rare binaries in nature. I mean, the other one I can think of is alive and dead. So, there's a little bit furry around the edge of alive and dead. Like if you're brain dead and you're on a life support machine, are you alive or dead? And it's about the same with sex. And then sex does actually have measurable and in some fields quite large consequences for the way you're going to live your life. Like, it's not nothing to be the sex that can be raped and that gets pregnant. This is quite major, and it's something that plays, it's foreshadowed in a woman's life all the way to when she has children, and then it has consequences after she has children. It has consequences even if you never have children. So every woman is affected by the fact that it's women who have children. And I don't think we could change that. And I also think that evolution has, more than most second-wave feminists ever admit, has shaped men and women to have somewhat different interests and strengths. About the same as our faces and our bodies. You know, measurable, meaningful, but not enormous. We're not enormously sexually dimorphic species. So I think that in a world where you can say with your hand on heart to a child, you're a boy, don't let that hold you back, you do you. You're a girl, don't let that hold you back, you do you. You will still find girls playing with dolls more. You will still find boys doing more rough and tumble play. But you'll find some kids with some regularity doing the opposite. There'll be overlap. You know, it'll shake out how it shakes out, and I'm happy with that. And that's what I want to see. And I think in a world like that, you would have an awful lot less gender distress, because you would have a lot less stigma for somebody who was, you know, behaving more similar to the opposite sex, and you would attach very little meaning to that. They'd just be a bit atypical. I mean, I have two sons, one is straight and one is gay, and the gay one is very atypical for a boy, and always was in many respects that you could call gender. And that's just fine. It's just the way it is. I don't attach any meaning to it, but I recognise it as a statistical pattern that has been proven. And I just want that for everybody. And then I think you would get very little gender distress in a world like that. You would get a lot of human flourishing. And you could treat those people as special cases in the same way that we treat people who are unusual in other respects. You know, we can't rewrite the whole world for them. We can't say that everybody is something different, but we can think in a compassionate way. I mean, we're a rich... You know, half the world is rich. We can make decisions like this. We can accommodate people. But that has to be what they want. And it's not what the leadership of the trans rights movement wants at the moment. They want to create what they see as a utopia, or an almost post-human version of humanity, that sex really isn't real, but that this gender is so incredibly important and real that people will kill themselves if you don't reify it. It's as if they're reifying gender. They are reifying gender, in fact. I don't know why I said as if. And I just find that a totally uninteresting thing to do. Like, I have many objections to Judith Butler. She's unreadable. It's all nonsense anyway when you try and force your way through it. But most of all, like, why is she so interested in gender? It's dull.
Helen Joyce, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It's dull. That we can finish there.